Where we left off was we were examining what I formulated as one of the core propositions within his Apology, where Socrates converses and meditates upon death at some length. And that proposition that I formulated was stated as follows: the fear of death is born of ignorance, not wisdom. So we talked about that at some length, and we tried to get at what the gist of that proposition means and what it implies about how it is we should meditate upon our death, how we should think about death and dying, and how we should maybe use this meditation as a daily practice in order to lead a more healthful life and to be better off overall, insofar as death is something that might cause us distress by thinking about it. If we can think about it in the proper way, perhaps we can be better adapted to handle its reality and its inevitability. So on that note, I thought we would shift to the second proposition. And the second proposition that I've formulated here, based upon another key passage within the Apology, is as follows: it is not difficult to avoid death when one's life is threatened, insofar as it is within one's locus of control to do so. But it is difficult to avoid the moral contagion of human vice, which spreads much more quickly than death. So let me just briefly recite the passage from the Apology in which Socrates talks about this proposition in somewhat different terms. Neither I nor any other man should, on trial or in war, strive to avoid death at any cost. Indeed, it is often obvious in battle that one could escape death by throwing away one's weapons and by turning to supplicate one's pursuers. And there are many ways to avoid death in every kind of danger, if one will venture to do or say anything to avoid it. It is not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen. And Socrates is addressing the men who are putting him on trial, the prosecutors, and he's addressing the jury perhaps as well. And so he says, it's not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen. It is much more difficult to avoid wickedness, for it runs faster than death. Slow and elderly as I am, I have been caught by the slower pursuer, whereas my accusers, being clever and sharp, have been caught by the quicker wickedness. I leave you now, condemned to death by you, but they are condemned by truth to wickedness and injustice. So I maintain my assessment, and they maintain theirs. This perhaps had to happen, and I think it is as it should be. So I think a lot is going on in this passage. Let me just briefly offer my reflections, what my takeaways were from reading this passage. Socrates is making the point that in certain situations in which we have a degree of control, we can avoid deaths. Socrates talks about, for example, the soldier escaping death in a battle by throwing away his weapons and supplicating his adversaries. But we can think of maybe more everyday examples, like looking both ways before crossing the street to avoid getting hit by a car. Now, Socrates is also suggesting that human vice, for example, wickedness, can develop more rapidly than death does. And he suggests that partaking of wicked actions can cause the vice of what I call moral contagion to rapidly grow and progress much more quickly than does the progress toward death. And I think this passage gets at some of the ethical questions, Ryan, that we've been addressing over the course of our previous conversation. And one of these is that is raised here is this question of what is the appropriate attitude toward death? And the appropriate attitude in the context of this passage is that insofar as it is within one's locus of control, one can avoid dying in certain situations in which one's life is threatened. And then another ethical question, which I think this passage raises, is how should one conduct oneself in regards to the reality of one's death? So I think this passage contains some practical wisdom, which might be stated as a precept such as avoid dying in situations in which it is within one's control to do so, or avoid dying in situations in which one has the power to do so. Such precepts may help one to reduce the fear of dying, which is not to say that the fear of death is inherently bad, but that perhaps when the fear is excessive or unrealistic, it may have maladaptive consequences. So that's sort of the wisdom that I extracted from reading the passage. I think it's a useful piece of wisdom, insofar as it is wisdom. I think that if you're mindful of the degree to which you can avoid threats like death, you should do so. And I think it's also just as important to avoid partaking of actions that can give rise to moral contagion, which I've called this fact of human psychology, which is that engaging in certain actions over and over and over again establishes it as a habit in our mind and in our behavior. So these activities we engage in can be ones that we might consider ones that are primarily vicious in nature. They are deviations from what we might consider to be moral conduct. We might judge them to be morally wrong or bad. So we generally when we engage in actions that tend towards those things, tend towards actions that perpetuate violations of certain moral rules, for example, or adverse consequences for others, harm, so on and so forth, or these actions might just be generally a sign of a trait we find to be despicable in some sense. I think when we engage in vicious behavior, that it's self-perpetuating in much the same way as a disease is, and can perpetuate itself rapidly in that respect. Whereas, the fear of death is something we have a degree of control over, and the reality of death, is not as nearly, we don't arrive at that event of our own death nearly as quickly as we arrive at a transgression of our moral nature, a deviation from the virtuous path. It's far easier to be a bad person, and it's far easier to get there quickly than it is to die. This is what I'm sort of extracting from this passage here. So I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Ryan.
It really stuck out to me, like the first part of the proposition, where he talks about neither I nor any other man should, on trial or on war, contrive to avoid death at any cost. And then he goes on to give those examples of turning in the weapons and supplicating to one's pursuers. So I think here what he's trying to get at is, it's better to have a good death than live sort of like a bad or a wicked existence by, just surrendering and supplicating to one's, enemies or pursuers. So in a way, I see like the moral contagion component as being almost like a response to the fear of death. So like we fear death, and so this will lead us to do certain things that are, morally wicked, or something that's, seen as, even treasonous or something to our country, to our people. That's sort of the relationship that I see between death and the moral contagion from this passage. And I think everything else you pretty much hit on. For me, so that's just all I kind of wanted to add to that, was that relationship between like living or having a good death versus, choosing to live, but living sort of like a wicked or corrupt existence. Think of Socrates here, like he's trying to live by his morals, his virtues, and what they're asking him to do is basically, like, the choice is basically die or like submit to the state and their morality and their laws, or live by your own virtue. And he's refusing to be corrupt by what he sees as the Athenian state, and he's choosing to have a good death rather than live like a wicked and corrupt life.